This will be my last video on the Cold War, and in this video I'll talk about some of the strategies of the Cold War, and then I'll talk about how the Cold War comes to an end. First strategy that we look at in this class is called MAD, and MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. It was the principle that you could hide submarines with nuclear weapons all around the globe. No one would know where they were. If someone launched a devastating attack against your country, you would be able to respond. And so the idea is that if one country, if either the United States or Russia is going to get nuked, the other one will get nuked as well. This is a pretty intense strategy. It's a pretty intense way of avoiding nuclear war. And so we start to see a process that's called Taunt midway through, probably beginning in the 60s, I think it's fair to say, late 50s, early 60s, which is a movement away from MAD, a kind of a cooling of relationships and kind of more subtle ways, colder ways, if you like. That's why it's called a Cold War, because it never heats up into an actual war between the United States and Russia. More subtle ways in which the United States and communist Russia compete against one another, compete to express the dominance or the superiority of their particular way of life. One of these means of competition is through the space race. Who can be more successful in space, who can show that their system of government and life promotes technology or promotes the development of technology better. Another area of conflict is Latin America. We find that instead of kind of a Truman doctrine of fighting communist governments with American soldiers, which is becoming very expensive, and as we saw in Vietnam, not very successful, that instead in Latin America we find that the United States government uses CIA operatives to overthrow and to oust and to lead or support coups against communist or communist-friendly governments to try and eliminate them from Latin America, which was seen as dangerously close to the United States. One of the results of this is first that the United States develops a reputation for meddling in other countries' affairs, and two, the governments that come to power as a result of these coups are the sorts of governments that you would expect to come to power after a coup. They're quite repressive dictatorships. And so that's a big way in which the Cold War affects Latin America. To speak about Cuba specifically, Fidel Castro overthrows an authoritarian regime in Cuba and replaces it with a communist authoritarian regime. American efforts to oust him are failures. And then the Americans discover that the Russians are planning to set up nuclear missiles in Cuba. And this is called the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the United States is trying to decide whether they will attack the Russian ship that they know is carrying the nuclear missiles to Cuba. Can they attack Cuba before Cuba launches nuclear missiles at the United States? And the talks are very intense, and eventually the Russians stand down. They get something from the Americans as well, but they stand down, putting nuclear missiles on Cuba, putting nuclear missiles so close to the United States. And this is said to be a point where people realize how close they actually came to a nuclear war. And how frightening that would be, how destructive that could be. And so it's from this point onwards that we see more and more efforts to encourage treaties and disarmament between nuclear powers. A couple of factors towards the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s are going to bring the Cold War to a close. The first, beginning in 1978, is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Soviets have supported the communist overthrow of the government in Afghanistan as a way of establishing an ally in Central Asia, as a way of getting closer to the Persian Gulf, closer to Iran, closer to being able to influence Middle Eastern oil supplies that America vitally needs. The United States is afraid of this and responds by supporting, encouraging, and arming Islamic groups to fight against the communists because of the communists' traditional repression of religion. And so we find Islamic groups like Al-Qaeda, and like the Taliban being formed at this time, receiving weapons from the United States to fight against Soviet Russia. And Afghanistan basically becomes Russia's Vietnam. It's a war that they cannot win against a populace that against a population that resents them in terrain that's almost impossible to conquer, and it just becomes this destructive force on the morale of the Soviet army. And eventually they pull out of Afghanistan, and a Taliban-led government replaces their government of the country. Lastly, we come to the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan becomes the president in 1980. He vows to fight communism wherever it is found, but avoids expensive and unpopular foreign interventionist wars. Instead, he basically outspends the Soviet Russia. He says, okay, like you have a system that provides equally good lifestyles as materially successful as ours. Let's prove it. Let's see you match American spending if we increase it just a little bit. And basically, Russia is being spent into the ground. They're having to spend 25% of their budget on the military, where the US, after Reagan's increases, is spending 6.5%. And so it just becomes an unsustainable rate of competition. And so in 1989, Russians admit that they can no longer use their army to control Eastern Europe, and all the Eastern European countries and some of the Central Asian countries break away. And the year after that, in 1990, the Communist Party is removed from power in Russia. And this brings the Cold War to an end. The idea of the communist state has been discredited because it seems as though the West can offer more freedom and more wealth.